Hey guys, it's Ellie. Welcome back to Bite-Sized Book of Mormon. I'm glad to have you with me. So if you've never been here before, this is just a podcast where I read through one chapter of the Book of Mormon each episode, and to give a little bit of context, a little bit of insight, a little bit of good times. So stick around. So if you remember last episode, we read Alma chapter 42, which concluded Alma's letters to his sons. First we had Helaman, then Shiblon, and then finally Corianton, which took 4 chapters. Corianton had a lot of questions, alright, but they were all answered. So Alma chapter 42 talks about Corianton's questions about sin. Like, why does sin have to exist? Why does the law of God have to exist? How does that really apply to the laws of justice and mercy? And it's super interesting, so go back and listen to that if you haven't already. But yeah, I think without further ado, let's begin the war chapters with Alma chapter 43. And now it came to pass that the sons of Alma did go forth among the people to declare the word unto them, and Alma also himself could not rest, and he also went forth. Now we shall say no more concerning their preaching, except that they preached the word, and the truth, according to the spirit of prophecy and revelation, and they preached after the holy order of God, by which they were called. And now I return to an account of the wars between the Nephites and the Lamanites in the 18th year of the reign of the judges. For behold, it came to pass that the Zoramites became Lamanites. Therefore, in the commencement of the 18th year, the people of the Nephites saw that the Lamanites were coming upon them. Therefore, they made preparations for war. Yea, they gathered together their armies in the land of Jershon. And it came to pass that the Lamanites came with their thousands, and they came into the land of Antionum, which is the land of the Zoramites, and a man by the name of Zarahemnah was their leader. And now, as the Amalekites were of a more wicked and murderous disposition than the Lamanites were, in and of themselves, therefore Zarahemnah appointed chief captains over the Lamanites, and they were all Amalekites and Zoramites. All right, so as I mentioned, this is the beginning of the war chapters, and if you know me, you know that I am so excited. There are a lot of people that are super bored by the war chapters, but I freaking love them. They're some of my favorite stories in the whole Book of Mormon. And you will soon find out why. So basically, if you remember, Alma 32, Alma 33, Alma 34, all those were chapters to the Zoramites, when Alma took a posse of people and they went and taught among the Zoramites in order to avoid a war and to kind of pacify them and chill them out. This didn't work, because a lot of the Zoramites that converted and left actually made the Zoramites more mad at the Nephites for taking some of their people away. I mean, they kicked them out, it was kind of half their fault. And then they started a war. But then we paused for like 6 chapters to hear Alma's letters to his sons. And now we're kind of resuming right where we left off, right before Alma started sending letters to his son Helaman. So, this is the same Zoramites attacking that Alma and his people taught. They are the same ones that did not listen. And what's interesting is not only did the Zoramites become Lamanites, as it says in verse 4, but also the Zoramites and a group that we've met before, the Amalekites, which are both Nephite dissenters, were more murderous than the Lamanites. So even though all 3 groups, the Amalekites, the Zoramites, and the Lamanites, don't like the Nephites, the Zoramites and the Amalekites used to be Nephites and are more murderous and are more violent and aggressive, which I think says something about the fact that they left the faith instead of just never having learned it, but that's a point for another day. And so in verse 5 we learn that the leader of the Lamanite army, which is kind of a mixture of Lamanites, Zoramites, and Amalekites, his name was Zarahemnah. And we know that he has murderous intent, because after in verse 6 saying that the Amalekites and the Zoramites were more murderous than the average Lamanite, it also says that Zarahemnah put those people in charge. All of the captains over the Lamanites were Amalekites and Zoramites. And so Zarahemnah is very intentionally creating a violent and an aggressive army to do the most damage. So it doesn't say here, but I presume that Zarahemnah is either an Amalekite or Zoramite himself because he wants to do the most harm that he can. And so Zarahemnah is far from someone to look up to, by the way, in case you were confused. Do not do what this guy does. Anyways, so now that we have this set up, Zarahemnah is leading an army of violent Lamanites to attack the Nephites. Now, what are the Nephites going to do about it? Now this he did that he might preserve their hatred towards the Nephites, that he might bring them into subjection to the accomplishment of his designs. For behold, his designs were to stir up the Lamanites to anger against the Nephites. This he did that he might usurp great power over them, and also that he might gain power over the Nephites by bringing them into bondage. And now the design of the Nephites was to support their lands and their houses and their wives and their children, that they might preserve them from the hands of their enemies, and also that they might preserve their rights and their privileges, yea, and also their liberty, that they might worship God according to their desires. For they knew that if they should fall into the hands of the Lamanites, that whosoever should worship God in spirit and in truth, the true and living God, the Lamanites would destroy. Yea, and they also knew the extreme hatred of the Lamanites towards their brethren, who were the people of Anti-Nephi-Lehi, who were called the people of Ammon, and they would not take up arms, yea, they had entered into a covenant, and they would not break it. Therefore, if they should fall into the hands of the Lamanites, they would be destroyed. And the Nephites would not suffer that they should be destroyed, therefore they gave them lands for their inheritance. And the people of Ammon did give unto the Nephites a large portion of their substance to support their armies, and thus the Nephites were compelled alone to withstand against the Lamanites, who were a compound of Laman and Lemuel and the sons of Ishmael, and all those who had descended from the Nephites, who were Amalekites and Zoramites and the descendants of the priests of Noah. So now we're getting more information about the motivation of both the Nephites in defending themselves and the Lamanites in attacking. And I've mentioned this before, but remember that in the Book of Mormon, this is an abridged record. So whatever story is kept in was kept in for a reason by Mormon. Mormon saw something in every single story that had value, and therefore he kept it. And for a lot of the stories in the war chapters, that tends to be a lesson on how to avoid the temptations of the devil. I think it's pretty clear that in this story, Zarahemnah represents Satan, basically, or his temptation or his strategy, whatever it may be. And I know that because in verse 7 and 8, it describes Zarahemnah's motivations for why he's doing what he's doing. And it sounds very Satan-like. Let me reread verses 7 and part of verse 8 really quick, and think of it in terms of Satan saying these words, and you'll find that it fits very well. It says, "Now this he did that he might preserve their hatred towards the Nephites, that he might bring them into subjection to the accomplishment of his designs. For behold, his designs were to stir up the Lamanites to anger against the Nephites. This he did that he might usurp great power over them." So Zarahemnah is someone who wants power. That is it. He wants power, and he will do anything to get it. Whatever dirty tricks he has to pull to gain power over people and to have them in subjection, as it says in verse 7, to him, he will do. And so he's a clear stand-in for Satan. So as we read this story, think about that and keep that in your mind. And also, it's really cool because in the following verse, right after verse 8, where it says that Zarahemnah just wants power, it says the design of the Nephites, which completely mirrors the design of the Lamanites. It is completely opposite. It talks about how they want to support their wives and their children and their land, and they want to preserve their rights, and they want to preserve their right to, worship God and their privileges, etc. And also, it says in verse 11 that they are protecting the people of Anti-Nephi-Lehi because they know that the Lamanites hate them. The Lamanites, for some reason, hate the Anti-Nephi-Lehis, but the Anti-Nephi-Lehis will not defend themselves. They've made a covenant to never fight again, and so they need to be defended. And so the Nephites are left to their own devices to defend this large group of people that doesn't have its own army. And so the resources of the Nephites are being stretched thin, but they will not ask the Anti-Nephi-Lehis to fight because that would be against their covenant. So yeah, not only are the Nephites defending themselves, but they're also defending the Anti-Nephi-Lehis, which are kind of their neighbors and kind of under the umbrella of Nephite. And so it's very selfless of them that even though there's so much pressure from the Lamanites and this big army is attacking, they not only defend themselves, but they also defend these defenseless neighbors of theirs that they've promised to protect. How very Christ-like of them to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Now those descendants were as numerous, nearly as were the Nephites, and thus the Nephites were obliged to contend with their brethren, even unto bloodshed. And it came to pass, as the armies of the Lamanites had gathered together in the land of Antionum, behold, the armies of the Nephites were prepared to meet them in the land of Jershon. Now the leader of the Nephites, or the man who had been appointed to be the chief captain over the Nephites, now the chief captain took the command of all the armies of the Nephites, and his name was Moroni. And Moroni took the command and the government of their wars, and he was only 25 years old when he was appointed chief captain over the armies of the Nephites. And it came to pass that he met the Lamanites in the borders of Jershon, and his people were armed with swords and with scimitars and all manner of weapons of war. And when the armies of the Lamanites saw that the people of Nephi, or that Moroni, had prepared his people with breastplates and arm shields, yea, and also shields to defend their heads, and also they were dressed with thick clothing, now the army of Zarahemnah was not prepared with any such thing. They had only their swords and their scimitars, and their bows and their arrows, and their stones and their slings, and they were naked, save it were a skin which was girded about their loins, yea, all were naked, save it were the Zoramites and the Amalekites. But they were not armed with breastplates nor shields, therefore they were exceedingly afraid of the armies of the Nephites because of their armor, notwithstanding their number being so much greater than the Nephites. So now we're kind of talking numbers and preparation for battle, alright? So now the two armies are actually facing each other, and they're kind of sizing each other up. So firstly, we know that there are way more Lamanites and Zoramites and Amalekites than there are Nephites. So that kind of globule that is opposing the Nephites, those three groups kind of put together, there's so many more of them than the Nephites. Despite that, the Lamanites are still kind of shaking in their boots a little bit. And it's iconic because the reason that they're afraid is because they came to war basically naked? Who in their right mind would do that? Like, the Nephites are armored. They have not only other weapons, but also helmets and breastplates and other shields. And the Lamanites just kind of have their weapons, and that is it. So bold of them to assume that because of their number they did not need armor. Because clearly armor does exist, and so it is wild to me that they did not choose to wear it. But what was interesting was that it seems to be a cultural thing, because the Amalekites and the Zoramites were clothed, or at least more clothed than the Lamanites. And I think that's because they come from the Nephites. That's just kind of how they were. Maybe it's just because they wore clothes more in everyday life. I don't know how unclothed the Lamanites were, but at the very least, their traditions of battle seem to be more armored than those of the Lamanites. So it's kind of interesting that even though they've left the Nephites behind and they've now allied themselves with the Lamanites, they still maintain some of that Nephite culture. Not very much of it, but they're wearing clothes, so there you go. Behold, now it came to pass that they durst not come against the Nephites in the borders of Jershon. Therefore they departed out of the land of Antionum into the wilderness, and took their journey round about in the wilderness away by the head of the river Sidon, that they might come into the land of Manti and take possession of the land. For they did not suppose that the armies of Moroni would know whither they had gone. But it came to pass, as soon as they had departed into the wilderness, Moroni sent spies into the wilderness to watch their camp. And Moroni also, knowing of the prophecies of Alma, sent certain men unto him, desiring him that he should inquire of the Lord whither the armies of the Nephites should go to defend themselves against the Lamanites. So something interesting about this verse 23, which I just read, is that we're learning more about how Moroni functions as a leader. I mean, we know he's faithful because he's heading the Nephite armies. You know, you have to be some man of faith for that. And also, he was 25, so he's really young in this role as well, so he probably has really good leadership skills for his age. But also, he relies not only on works, but also on faith. Both of those aspects are reflected in verse 23. Because when the Lamanites run away, which is hilarious that they just ran as soon as they saw the Nephites' armor, not only did he send spies after them to make sure he knew where they were, which is works, but also he went and sent people to ask the prophet Alma where he should put his armies to defend their lands the best. And so he did a practical works-based thing where he physically sent spies to go follow the Lamanites, but also he trusted in the revelation of God through Alma to see where he should put his armies so he could best defend the people. This man is a man of balance, alright? He does not overly rely on his spies, and he also doesn't overly rely on the revelation from God. And because he does that, he is successful. This is why Captain Moroni is so famous in the Book of Mormon. This is why he was so successful, because he does both. It reminds me of the principle of, when we're looking for an answer to a prayer, not only do we pray, but we also research. Like, if we're thinking of choosing between two jobs, not only do we pray to see which one God would have us choose, but we also do research and ask around and find out more about both options. That is something that we are counseled to do, and that is an example of the same principle that Captain Moroni is applying here. Doing both. And it came to pass that the word of the Lord came unto Alma, and Alma informed the messengers of Moroni, that the armies of the Lamanites were marching round about in the wilderness, that they might come over into the land of Manti, that they might commence an attack upon the weaker part of the people. And those messengers went and delivered the message unto Moroni. Now Moroni, leaving a part of his army in the land of Jershon, lest by any means a part of the Lamanites should come into that land and take possession of the city, took the remaining part of his army and marched over into the land of Manti. And he caused that all the people in that quarter of the land should gather themselves together to battle against the Lamanites, to defend their lands and their country, their rights and their liberties. Therefore, they were prepared against the time of the coming of the Lamanites. And it came to pass that Moroni caused that his army should be secreted in the valley, which was near the bank of the river Sidon, which was on the west of the river Sidon in the wilderness. And Moroni placed spies round about, that he might know when the camp of the Lamanites should come. And now, as Moroni knew the intention of the Lamanites, that it was their intention to destroy their brethren, or to subject them and bring them into bondage, that they might establish a kingdom unto themselves over all the land, and he also knowing that it was the only desire of the Nephites to preserve their lands and their liberty and their church, therefore he thought it no sin that he should defend them by stratagem. Therefore he found by his spies which course the Lamanites were to take. Therefore he divided his army and brought a part into the valley and concealed them on the east and on the south of the hill Riplah. And the remainder he concealed in the west valley, on the west of the river Sidon, and so down into the borders of the land Manti. And thus having placed his army according to his desire, he was prepared to meet them. So now, not only has Moroni listened to his spies, and he's still taking information from them, but he fully trusts Alma's revelation. He fully knows what the Lamanites are going to do, because Alma said, hey, they're going to go attack Manti. So he goes directly to Manti. And we can presume that the Lamanites are kind of wandering in the wilderness to eventually attack Manti, when, the Nephites are expecting it the least. But Moroni is able to beat them there by going straight, and he prepares the people of Manti, and he prepares his army to defend themselves. And so he's placing his armies, he's hiding his armies round about the land, and he's also preparing the people in the city itself to defend themselves. So they are as prepared as they can be. Not only are they there before the Lamanites, but the Lamanites don't know that they beat them. The Lamanites don't know that their armies are hidden in nearby valleys and hills. So let's see how the trap goes when the Lamanites walk into it. And it came to pass that the Lamanites came up on the north of the hill, where a part of the army of Moroni was concealed. And as the Lamanites had passed into the valley and began to cross the river Sidon, the army which was concealed on the south of the hill, which was led by a man whose name was Lehi, and he led his army forth and encircled the Lamanites about on the east and in the rear. And it came to pass that the Lamanites, when they saw the Nephites coming upon them in their rear, turned them about and began to contend with the army of Lehi. And the work of death commenced on both sides, but it was more dreadful on the part of the Lamanites, for their nakedness was exposed to the heavy blows of the Nephites, with their swords and their scimitars, which brought death almost at every stroke. While on the other hand, there was now and then a man fell among the Nephites by their swords and the loss of blood, they being shielded from the more vital parts of the body, or the more vital parts of the body being shielded from the strokes of the Lamanites by their breastplates and their arm shields and their head plates, and thus the Nephites did carry on the work of death among the Lamanites. And it came to pass that the Lamanites became frightened because of the great destruction among them, even until they began to flee towards the river Sidon. And they were pursued by Lehi and his men, and they were driven by Lehi into the waters of Sidon. And they crossed the waters of Sidon, and Lehi retained his armies upon the bank of the river Sidon, that they should not cross. And it came to pass that Moroni and his army met the Lamanites in the valley on the other side of the river Sidon, and began to fall upon them and to slay them. And the Lamanites did flee again before them towards land of Manti, and they were met again by the armies of Moroni. Now in this case the Lamanites did fight exceedingly, yea, never had the Lamanites been known to fight with such exceedingly great strength and courage, no, not even from the beginning. And they were inspired by the Zoramites and the Amalekites, who were their chief captains and leaders, and by Zarahemnah, who was their chief captain, or their chief leader and commander. Yea, they did fight like dragons, and many of the Nephites were slain by their hands. Yea, for they did smite in two many of their head plates, and they did pierce many of their breastplates, and they did smite off many of their arms, and thus the Lamanites did smite in their fierce anger. Nevertheless, the Nephites were inspired by a better cause, for they were not fighting for monarchy nor power, but they were fighting for their homes and their liberties, their wives and their children, and their all, yea, for their rights of worship and their church. So this is fascinating. So the Lamanites did get properly trapped by what Moroni set up. The Lamanites were surrounded very quickly. First they ran into the armies of Lehi, and then into one of the armies of Moroni, and then, when they turned around towards the land of Manti, another. So they are fighting 3 armies now, and they are, as it says, fighting like dragons. It brings to mind the image of an animal that is trapped, and, trapped animals are a lot more violent and aggressive than they would be otherwise, because they feel so threatened and so trapped. That is how the Lamanites are responding. That is why they're so mad, and that is why they're cleaving these head plates in two, as it says. And yet, what I love is in verse 45 it says, "Nevertheless," after describing the Lamanites fighting like dragons, the Nephites were inspired by a better cause. So despite the strength with which the Lamanites fought, because they were trapped and felt so threatened and endangered, the Nephites fought for a better cause. And it is because of that higher cause that they fought for that caused them to have success. And also the fact that they had the upper hand and also were actually armored. Because they'd actually prepared themselves and listened to the revelation from God on where to go. So, anyways, they had the upper hand in many ways. But the most important one, and the one that's most emphasized, is that they were fighting for a higher cause. That they weren't fighting for power, or for pride, or for greed. They were fighting for their families, and for their beliefs. And they were doing that which they felt was the duty which they owed to their God. For the Lord had said unto them, and also unto their fathers, that inasmuch as ye are not guilty of the first offense, neither the second, ye shall not suffer yourselves to be slain by the hands of your enemies. And again the Lord has said, that ye shall defend your families even unto bloodshed. Therefore, for this cause were the Nephites contending with the Lamanites, to defend themselves, and their families, and their lands, and their country, and their rights, and their religion. And it came to pass that when the men of Moroni saw the fierceness and the anger of the Lamanites, they were about to shrink and flee from them. And Moroni, perceiving their intent, sent forth and inspired their hearts with these thoughts, yea, the thoughts of their lands, their liberty, yea, their freedom from bondage. And it came to pass that they turned upon the Lamanites, and they cried with one voice unto the Lord their God for their liberty and their freedom from bondage. And they began to stand against the Lamanites with power. And in that selfsame hour that they cried unto the Lord for their freedom, the Lamanites began to flee before them, and they fled even to the waters of Sidon. Now the Lamanites were more numerous, yea, by more than double the number of the Nephites. Nevertheless, they were driven, insomuch that they were gathered together in one body in the valley upon the bank by the river Sidon. Therefore the armies of Moroni encircled them about, yea, even on both sides of the river, for behold, on the east were the men of Lehi. Therefore when Zarahemnah saw the men of Lehi on the east of the river Sidon, and the armies of Moroni on the west of the river Sidon, that they were encircled about by the Nephites, and they were struck with terror. Now Moroni, when he saw their terror, commanded his men that they should stop shedding their blood. What an interesting ending. Because if you think about it, the Nephites have the upper hand, like in every single way. Not only are they more armored, but the Lamanites are also surrounded and they're stuck in a river. Because there's Nephites on the east side and on the west side, so they're kind of stuck in the river. And not only all of that, but the Nephites are fighting for a higher and holier purpose that inspires them in a way that the Lamanites are not inspired. So even though the Lamanites outnumber the Nephites by a vast margin, the Nephites have the upper hand in every other way. Because they're fighting for something more than pride or greed or power. They're fighting for God. And again, that brings me to the surprise ending of the chapter where Moroni tells his armies to stop attacking. They had every reason to continue. They would have won. They could have killed every single one of those Lamanites. But that's not why they're fighting. So there's no reason to kill them. They're defending themselves. Why would they kill every last Lamanite when they're just defending themselves? They've clearly won. And the Lamanites are clearly in terror. And so what would be the point in finishing them off? That is how you know that Captain Moroni is a godly man. He is true to his values. When he says he's fighting for God in self-defense, he is fighting for God in self-defense. And he will follow that through with his actions. He is not fighting for vengeance, even though the Lamanites have done such bad things to them, even though the Lamanites hate them to such a degree. Captain Moroni will not kill them unjustly. There is a reason that Captain Moroni has been so famous, so well loved, and so successful, is because he's a man of God. And not only that, he's also a practical man. As I mentioned before, he does both the physical works and the spiritual works to get it done. So the stand-up verse for this chapter is going to be verse 50, which says, "And they began to stand against the Lamanites with power, and in that selfsame hour that they cried unto the Lord for their freedom, the Lamanites began to flee before them, and they fled even to the waters of Sidon." So in order to inspire his men, he sent among them words of inspiration, talking about God and liberty and freedom and religion. And in the verse right before this, it describes how they all cried with one voice unto the Lord their God. And the reason that I chose verse 50 is because it is an answer to that prayer. God protects his people, especially when they're faithful. So as it says in verse 50, in the self-same hour that they had cried unto God, the Lamanites fled. Keep in mind, the Lamanites had them vastly outnumbered, and they were fighting violently like trapped animals, and yet the Nephites won. In the same hour that they cried with one voice to the Lord their God. If that does not demonstrate that God protects his people, I don't know what does. So yeah, that is the episode for today. I hope you enjoyed. Oh, I'm so excited. I love the war chapters. I've said this a million times, but I love the war chapters. They're so cool. And it is a lot of war, but also, what can we learn from it, you know? We learned to be prepared in this chapter, basically. Zarahemnah was prepared in 0 ways, when Moroni prepared in so many ways. So, anyways, good stuff. But yeah, I just want to let you know about a few links down in the show notes. Firstly, there's a quick let me know you learned link. So if you shoot me a message, you can do that there, or you can DM me on Instagram, either way. Secondly, there are a few links to access a digital copy of the Book of Mormon. So if you want to access that for yourself, read a chapter you like, read a verse you like, you can go ahead and do that there. Thirdly, there's a quick support the show link, so if you want to shoot me a few dollars and support what I do as an independent podcast creator, that would be greatly appreciated. Next, we are on YouTube, so if you want to go subscribe to the YouTube channel, you can find the podcast there. And also, every once in a while, trivia. I haven't been very good at updating that, but it is there. And finally, we are on Instagram, so if you want to go follow me on Instagram, you can find episode clips, standout verses, meme reels, etc., trivia, all that good stuff. It's all on there. So yeah, go follow me there. And yeah, that's all I've got for you today. I'll talk to you later. Bye.